Hi, Dr. Dick Webster again on my ongoing video blog series on the travesty of patient access to PET-CT in Ontario with the Liberal government's so-called evidence-based patients first healthcare system. And I had done my first blog on the first ombudsman, Ms. Amaral, who ultimately dismissed all the concerns and issues that my colleagues had raised. It would be helpful if you haven't seen it to go back and review that one. So this is entitled my second kick at the can, and now with the next ombudsman I would deal with, and that is Mr. Marin. And ultimately what I'm asking people to consider is that how could blatantly unethical and ultimately immoral experiments be performed on cancer patients, and continue to this day, by the way, with all these so-called safeguards in place in what you think you live in is this sort of open, transparent, and accountable democracy. So let's just review the Ombudsman's website statement so I understand it fully, and that is the Ontario Ombudsman promotes fairness, accountability, keep that one in mind, and of course transparency in the public sector by resolving and investigating public complaints as well as addressing systemic issues. Now, sounds like exactly the perfect safeguard to make sure that our politicians and their bureaucrats do not abuse the citizens of Ontario, particularly some of our sickest and most distressed patients. So, again, what I'm asking you now to consider is whether Mr. Marin is a watchdog and a safeguard against governments, or are they simply the Liberals, they're just lapdogs for the Liberals. So, quite simply, it's this. As I said with Ms. Amaral, when I was so ultimately devastated by the fact that I finally realized when she dismissed all of our concerns on an utterly baseless process that she did on that evaluation, it just simply made clear how deep the tentacles of this Liberal government went into our system to ensure that they could ultimately carry out what can be not interpreted as anything else except an agenda directed against our patients, all in a hopeless attempt to try and keep costs of healthcare down. So what happened was I'd heard that a breast cancer patient from Ottawa complained to Mr. Marin about the lack of access to PET. So I thought, fine, I'll make one more attempt. Let's try this again with a different ombudsman. So what I did was I contacted the office. I was assigned a case investigator. You don't actually speak with the ombudsman usually directly, and to make a long story short, I submitted all the documents I had and all the relevant issues related to how the government had its experts evaluate the quotes quality of evidence on PET, so that they could then determine whether or not they would fund OHIP for PET coverage or not. In other words, establish policies on how they would view PET going on into the future. And what I included was a lot of the background dirty laundry, as it were, amongst the various physician specialties who were now wanting to get in on a piece of the action, as it were. So what happened was we started the process, and in a very interesting irony was that the investigator told me that the government was stonewalling Mr. Marin. Now, for those who've seen my video on Ms. Amaral, what she, of course, did was dismiss the government's blatant attempts to stonewalling of every question and issue we had submitted to them over the years, and said the government had answered all the questions, where of course in fact they hadn't. So that was interesting. Now, what happens in June each year is that the Ombudsman issues their annual report, and in June 2008, Mr. Marin did publicly state that this was the most complex investigation he'd ever carried out, the one he was doing on PET, but the government hadn't gotten back to him. So then in December 2008, the investigator told me that finally Mr. Marin had finished, I think it was a 32-page document listing all the issues that came in the documents I gave him, raising questions and concerns, and particularly asking the government to respond to these issues that we raised about unethical experiments and so on. And the government was supposed to be back to Mr. Marin by February 2009. So if you can guess, the sun is coming up tomorrow, you would guess that the government did not respond by February 2009. So June 2009, Mr. Marin, he makes his annual report again, and again comments that the government is not getting back to him on these issues. So about 3 weeks later, what happens is the Ministry of Health announces a couple of things related to PET, but the most important issues are that it is going to cover a couple of very meager indications for PET under OHIP for related to lung nodules and lung cancer. Now, of course, what Mr. Marin was aware, and hopefully you are now by watching my videos, is that these indications were the exact opposite of the entire world expert body of opinion, using an absolutely scientifically baseless process called health technology assessment. So, what was Mr. Marin's response to this issue? Well, there was two conclusions, major ones that we need to consider. The first one is that he declares that all of his concerns were satisfied with the government's now allowing this coverage of the indications, as I've said, which were the exact opposite of the world body of opinion, but most importantly that this, as I've shown in their videos, will have dire consequences for our patients and continues so to this day. Now I want you to think about this for a moment. So this 32-page document with all these questions and concerns was simply dismissed by the government saying, oh, we're going to cover a couple of these indications. That's a pretty extraordinary thing. And not only that, is that he will go on later to congratulate the government on their handling of PET. So, but then Mr. Marin goes one insulting step further. So his next conclusion is that now Mr. Marin claims that my colleagues and I, we were simply confused. He basically points out to us and says, listen, my role is not to evaluate policies already in place, in this case related to how the government will fund PET. His role was to evaluate the process by which the policies were established. Think about that. So, I mean, if you haven't already realized, there actually were no policies in place whatsoever on PET before he wrote the report. Obviously, every issue we brought forward to that point was about the very processes by which the government would evaluate PET, and that included unethical experiments on patients and so on and so forth, using the scientifically baseless process. So, Mr. Marin insults the intelligence and professionalism of Canadian and international PET experts. So then what he does is he actually does some further things. And so he gets involved, and I'll talk more about this later in another video. Mr. Sam Bruno, a very noble man I've spoken of before in videos, colon cancer, and from Sudbury, really got the government's attention, and they did everything they could to shut him down, and Mr. Marin would then become part of this. One of the things Mr. Bruno was asking was that Mr. Marin would release that full investigation. So what Mr. Marin did was he sent one of his accomplices up to chat with Sam. I think they had a glass of Zambuca in his little garden there, which he loved so much, and basically convinced him, tricked him into thinking that they'd actually carried out what he wanted to have done. And of course they didn't. What they released to him, and he saw, was simply the final summary, which of course was another whitewash of everything that he understood. Then he would go one step further, and I was outraged at this response, as you might expect, and what I was told by my investigators that Mr. Marin has the power to bury investigations and his work from the public if he does not think that it would be of any further value to the issues that we were dealing with. Really, the most, the unprecedented accusations by the international medical community and Canadians against what the Ontario government is doing to patients, and somehow he doesn't think it's worthy of releasing his investigation into this. So, again, I ask the question. Is Mr. Marin a watchdog for the government, carrying out the duties as outlined in their statement, or is he yet another liberal, lapdog? So in my next video, what I'm going to do is then I go to the next ombudsman, who happens to be our current ombudsman, Mr. Paul Dubé, and Ms. Barb Finley, who is the deputy watchdog of Ontario. This is Mr. Paul Dubé, and this is Ms. Barb Finley. If you look at the lectern there, it says sharpening the teeth. Let's just see how sharp the teeth are on these particular watchdogs. So thanks for watching. I'd actually released this video initially and realized I'd forgotten some critical parts to it, so I've re-released it, and hopefully this will make more sense of where I'm going with all of this and our safeguards. So thanks, and let's keep up the work. Appreciate your support.